On this episode of the WildFed podcast.
The first domesticated species is us. We domesticated ourselves beginning 3.5 million years ago, and it was as simple as making our first stone tool.
Technology is kind of like fundamental to our species, right? Without fire, without leverage, without cutting surfaces, we almost can't be human in the way we think of it.
I just witnessed the healthiest people I've ever seen. Of the two things that they eat literally every single day, one of them is illegal for me to get, and the other one is incredibly difficult for me to get.
When I hear food processing now, I think a very positive thing. I think taking a raw ingredient and turning it into something that I can eat or store.
Of fruits, vegetables, and insects were by far the most nutrient-dense, the most bioavailable, and definitely the safest.
We're living in kind of a food desert, even though we're all overeating ourselves to death.
Wild animals, they live incredible lives and then keel over dead. That's what life should be like.
Episode 108 of the WildFed podcast, Eat Like a Human with Dr. Bill Schindler, is brought to you by Surthrival. Why just survive when you could thrive? Surthrival.com is your source for nature-based nutritional supplements that keep you thriving in the modern world. From hormone health to immune support, increased metabolism to exercise recovery, Surthrival keeps you thriving when others are just surviving. Check out their pine pollen pure potency for testosterone support, colostrum for a smoothie ingredient that's 3 times more effective against the flu than vaccines, elk antler for powerful growth and recovery, medicinal mushrooms for immunomodulation and powerful antioxidant capability, and vitamin D3 for all the protective properties you've been hearing about during this pandemic. Go to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup and use the coupon code WILDFED for 5% off your order. Surthrival. Why just survive when you could thrive? Hunting can be an incredible tool for personal transformation, helping you discover more about yourself, your environment, the animals you share this world with, and even helping you develop a deeper understanding of life and death itself. Hunting can help you find your place in the community of life. But you can hunt all your life and never find that kind of personal transformation. It takes deliberate practice, awareness, and sometimes even initiation. That's why my friend Monsell Denton created Sacred Hunting. Sacred Hunting brings new or experienced hunters out onto the landscape to stalk, harvest, and field dress animals in a retreat setting in conjunction with sweat lodges, plant medicine ceremonies held on separate days from the hunt, of course, and a strong intention setting that prepares hunters for a lifelong spiritual relationship with themselves, the land, and the animals they hunt. If you want to learn to hunt in this way, check out sacredhunting.com. There's only a few spots available on each hunt, so go to sacredhunting.com and complete their 2-minute application. Discounts are available if you let them know you heard about them on the WildFed podcast. Again, go to sacredhunting.com to learn more about Monsell Denton and Sacred Hunting. Go to episode 59 of the WildFed podcast. Again, go to sacredhunting.com and you can learn more about Monsell and Sacred Hunting on episode 59 of the WildFed podcast. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Today's show really harkens back to my roots. My earliest work was focused on nutrition, which has been a primary interest of mine for more than 2.5 decades. I eventually landed on a wild food lifestyle by following that thread of interest wherever it led. After becoming very dissatisfied with modern dietary dogma and popular fad diets, I started looking into our ancestral past for clues about what the human animal needs for nutritional inputs and what worked historically. This line of thinking's become much more mainstream in recent years, with the popularization of paleo and primal-type dietary approaches. But in decades past, it wasn't something many people were thinking about. With the incredible farm-to-table ethos that's developed here in North America in recent years, our younger listeners might not realize what a nutritional desert the United States was just 20 years ago. Not just in the foods available then, but also the quality of nutritional information that we had access to. We've recently gone through a nutritional renaissance here, and in the aftermath, ideas like ancestral nutrition programs have enjoyed popularity in both the mainstream culture and the scientific literature. Which leads me to our guest today, Bill Schindler, author of the new book, Eat Like a Human. His book lays out simply and clearly the foundations of a zoologically appropriate human diet based on both medical and nutritional science, but also on several 100,000 years of evolutionary history. Bill and I, while coming from really different origin stories, have landed on very similar conclusions about food and how we relate to it. Reading Bill's book, I was constantly muttering, "Yep," to myself as I saw how he expressed the core human dietary concepts that he, myself, and many others have been assembling over the years. Because it's concepts like those he explores in his book that have led to me hunting, fishing, foraging, and making this podcast and the WildFed TV show. In other words, it was the desire to integrate ancestral practices into a modern life that led to WildFed. But you don't have to harvest your own food to start putting these kinds of dietary practices in place. You can learn to forage the produce section and hunt the deli area of your local grocer. Bill's book will show you how. Follow that path long enough and you might just find yourself in the woods or on the sea chasing the most nutritious and ancestrally coherent food you can find. So you can, like Bill says, eat like a human. Dr. Bill Schindler, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Man, I'm really sitting here with your book, Eat Like a Human. This just came out, I think, and I'm having a blast. First of all, I love your logo, which is the chef's knife crossed with the like a Stone Age ads. I really like that. But I think the book just came out. Tell us a little bit about it. Give us your backstory.
Yeah, so I am by training an archaeologist and anthropologist. I've always been interested in food. In fact, food is sort of, if nothing else, plagued me my entire life, trying to understand how to feed myself and try to be as healthy as possible. But my entire life I've been interested in the past and the primitive technology and with hunting and fishing and trapping. And it wasn't until about 20 years ago that I was able to really draw the ties between these different threads in my life, this sort of primitive technology, archaeology, anthropology side, and sort of human nutrition and health. And it's such obvious, the link is so obvious to all of us, or so many of us today. But to me, it was this light bulb moment when I realized that just about every single prehistoric technology ever invented has something to do with food. Getting food, processing food, storing food, cooking food. And really, when I realized that, I realized the importance of understanding the role of technology in our ancestral diets.
Bill, I have followed a very different but very parallel line of thinking and career over the years. It's fascinating to hear you say that. And it's amusing to me to see in my own journey how silly it seems now that I didn't piece it all together as well. It took me a long time also. I was on this quest, like, what's the natural human diet? And it took me so long to actually just turn to anthropology and be like, hey, what do we know about pre-agricultural people and what they ate? But so that's fascinating. I think maybe we should start off by just defining what you mean by technology so that the audience understands. We're not necessarily talking about, iPhones and internet stuff, but we could be talking about as simple as, maybe fracturing a stone.
Absolutely. So I think really to start off even that conversation, what it lays the foundation for all of my research, all of the work that I do, all of my teaching, and even all of my cooking is a basic understanding. And this may come as a surprise to many people to even say this, but this basic understanding that humans are biologically one of the weakest species on the planet. And if we really come to terms with that idea, then we look at the world around us, our natural environment, our place in the world through a completely different lens, a humbling lens, but one that is filled with technological advancements that have been around for over 3.5 million years. And really that plays, like I said earlier, a very large role in my understanding of how we eat a healthy human diet. So we love, I talk about this in the book, we love to celebrate those members of our species that are incredibly strong and powerful and these great athletes. And, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Michael Phelps, Usain Bolt, a whole bunch. And we should celebrate them. They're amazing. But when we compare them to other animals on the planet, they're
like chimpanzee.
Yeah, I mean, they can't. I mean, the strongest animal on the planet is a dung beetle, and the fastest animal is a Californian mite, right? So but when you think about it, that plays a very large role in food, like getting food. How do we access food? I tell my students all the time, if I stripped you down completely naked and threw you in the middle of the woods and said, live. Well, even first off, in most places in the world, they die of exposure, right? But other
Hmm.
than that, as far as food is concerned, even if we knew if they knew all the edible plants and knew all the different animal behavior patterns and all, they would die of starvation, because we have reached a point in our evolutionary track that we require technology to access incredible foods from our environment in order to feed ourselves. But even more importantly, and this really speaks to what you asked earlier about technology, for as weak as we are biologically, we have an incredibly inefficient digestive system. In fact, one of the least efficient of any animal on the planet. And for a similar sized primate, our guts are about 60% the size of what a similar sized primate should have. And that speaks directly to many things, like how long, how efficient are we at digesting food? How long can food sit there? How much food can we eat in any given moment? And if nutrition comes down to the basic idea of trying to get incredible nutrients from our environment into our bodies, and our bodies breaking them down and actually making use of them, then we're really crippled from the very beginning. We're really starting at a bad spot. So when I say technology, I mean those things that allow us to access nutrients from our environment, and then to turn those nutrients into their safest and most nourishing form for our bodies. And it's as simple as a stone tool, or fire, or a pit in the ground that we can use to ferment.
Going back to what you've said, and something I try to impress upon people a lot here on this show is just because I think it sort of changes how people perceive the world. It's like fundamental. And I noticed in your book you bring up some of the research by Richard Wrangham.
I
I think
love
that's
Richard
his name.
Wrangham. Yeah.
Yeah, his book Catching Fire is a great read. But I try to point out to people, like, human beings were born with fire. Homo sapiens, right? So not like,
Yep.
because I think people imagine a time where Homo sapiens learns fire. It's like, no, 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 no. The species that preceded us had fire, so we are born of fire. So that fundamental technology is part of our current form, our current expression. It's like, and I had a conversation with a very prominent and extremely intelligent forager recently. I didn't call him out on this, but I said, humans can't really live without fire. He's like, well, a human could live without fire. It's like, yeah, if you deliver all their food to them, but like we need fire for basic food preparation. I don't think that a human could really live very long without, at least electricity, which I kind of think of as fire. So technology is kind of like fundamental to our species, right? Like you said, all those weaknesses, without fire, without leverage, without cutting surfaces, we almost can't be human in the way we think of it.
Well, we can't be. I think this is another. I love when people say things that are profound enough that make you change the way you look at the world. For example, when Michael Pollan talked about humans being domesticated by corn, that's that sort of thing. Um, a- and here's another way that I view all of this, that I think is fundamental and to the argument and the role of technology. A lot of people ask me all the time, I'm sorry, what was the first domesticated species? As far as plants are as far as plants are concerned, most people look at something like maize, for example. Now, there's a possibility that maize may have been domesticated around 15,000 years ago. That's a very early date for a plant. And animals, well, dog is usually what people cite as the earliest domesticated animal. That happens
And
somewhere probably.
archaeologically, they're still saying pretty similar dates to the one you just quoted for maize.
Well, actually, no. There's some suggestions that it's 30 to 35,000 years ago for a dog. Um,
Genetics, not archaeological, right?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But most of your domestication of animals begins somewhere closer to 8 to 10,000 years. Most of the
Yeah.
major ones are happening around that time period. But if you my next question is somebody asking me that question is, well, how do you define domestication? To me, domestication is taking a species out of its natural environment, putting it in a human culturally created environment, and tending to it, either feeding it or keeping it safe or giving it water, or protecting it, whatever. And over time, that species genetically changes to the point that it's different, and that in many cases it can't survive on its own any longer. And if that's your definition, which I think is a decent one, then the answer to that question for the first domesticated species is us. We
Hmm.
domesticated ourselves beginning 3.5 million years ago, and it was as simple as making our first stone tool. And as soon as we created that stone tool, we actually created our environment. We overcame our physical limitations and we're able to interact with the outside world in entirely new and powerful ways. And think, just striking two rocks together and creating a sharp edge can take less than a second, but you've created in that second, in that instant, something that's sharper than anything on our body, incredibly durable, and can be resharpened at a moment's notice. And
Mm.
we no longer have to worry about things like our teeth or our canines or our fingernails to slice and rip and tear. We can do it with this tool. And for the first time ever, we could access, animals and scavenge on the savannah. And, simple technologies like stone tools, fire, fermentation, hunting technology, all of these things allow us to overcome our physical limitations, access increasingly diverse and nutrient dense resources from our environment, and then prepare them to make them as safe and nourishing as possible. And because we're able to do that, we're introducing foods and foods in a state that we never have before, and it's supporting our body and brain growth. And when that happens, our bodies and brains are growing, in response to these, for lack of a better term, unnatural diets, right? Diets that we aren't designed to be eating, but our species and our ancestral species are entirely embracing these diets, and our bodies are thriving and growing, and
Hmm.
our brains are growing. And now we're at a point that we've out-eaten our digestive tracts. We can't do it on our own any longer. We still require those technologies to process food to make it safe and nourishing as possible. And I do want to make sure that everyone understands when I say processing food, I mean it in a very positive way, not modern food, processed food, where we're talking about things like Oreos and Doritos, which is a completely different set of processing technologies. But yet we've domesticated ourselves. We can't live without those technologies that we've invented in our own cultural system. And uh, that's what in this book, I wholly embrace the idea that technology plays a very important role in transforming food to nourish our human bodies.
Yeah, as a forager and hunter, I spend a lot of time. I'm not somebody who sends my animals off to a game butcher, but I do that work myself, and I process my own. Everything from wild rice to nuts and seeds and fruits, and you kind of start to realize like how much time, anthropologists will talk about how much leisure the hunter gatherers had, but it's like, well, let's define leisure. If leisure means that I'm sitting there chilling out but also grinding something, cracking something, braiding something, because it's a lot of processing. And I'm always trying to point out, like, when people say processed food, I think they mean industrially processed food.
Right.
And there's this, you can really understand why the idea initially, when you could buy processed food, what a big deal that was. Because, it's like the first time people weren't spending all their time doing this processing work. But when I hear food processing now, like you said, I think a very positive thing. I think taking a raw ingredient and turning it into something that I can eat or store. Um,
Hmm.
that's like a huge part of what my life is. So it's ironic because when you get into this kind of diet, people think, oh, you're done with processed foods. It's like, actually, I spend most of my time
That's all that
processing
you do.
food. It's really interesting. Yeah. Wow. I want to say too, my friend Arthur, who's a taxonomist, we've kind of somewhat tongue in cheek, proposed the idea of calling our sort of modern phenotype, Homo sapiens domestico fragilis, the fragile domesticated form, But yeah, man, I'm in agreement with you, and I like the way that you broke your book down. Let's start right at the beginning. You open the book with a story of you and your family in Africa. If you could tell me the group, I want to say Maasai, but I don't think that was the group you named.
No, it was a Samburu, but they're very similar in that they're both nomadic pastoralists, and they do the same practice that we
Okay, so you
document in the
you
book.
start
Yeah.
talking about drinking blood and milk, and I had just come back from South Dakota, where I harvested a bison there, and my Lakota friend had me drinking blood, from that bison, and a week later, your book comes in the mail, and I open it up, and there you are drinking blood in Africa, and I thought, oh, I really get where this guy's coming from. So, you maybe kind of let's start there and
Sure.
start telling us a little bit about this journey, because you're following this thread of hunter-gatherer diet, has led you kind of all around the world a little bit, huh?
Yeah, and I've been very lucky too. In most of the cases, my entire family's been with me, and I've thought that was really important. Number one, just as a father, I wanted and if I'm experiencing something, I wanted my whole family to be able to do it as well. But I also, first, in preparation for this book, I wanted to make this book and any kind of teaching I do as accessible and relevant to as many people as possible. And for a 40-something-year-old man experiencing and writing about it, there's a certain audience for that. But I wanted to experience it through the eyes of my kids and through my wife, and that was really powerful, especially in this instance. So we went to Kenya to study. Actually, we went to Kenya really to study dairy. Different traditional approaches to dairy. We were out on the West and West Pokot looking at something called Mursik, which is an ash yogurt that's traditionally made there. And then we went to study with the Samburu, who are nomadic pastoralists, just like the Maasai, which means they keep animals and they travel all over the place following these animals, because for half the year during the dry season, these animals, the food is so poor for these animals. They have to eat massive quantities to get their to meet their nutritional needs. And they have to just move and move and move and find new places to eat. So, they don't. What's interesting is most people would probably think about a group of people whose economy is based and food source is based on keeping animals as being major meat eaters, but they're not. In fact, they rarely kill their animals. When they do, they eat massive quantities of meat and everything else inside of the animal. But what's fascinating is that the mainstay of their diet and what they eat literally every single day is a combination of blood and fresh raw milk. And they look at blood. We look at blood. The example you just gave of hunting recently and drinking the blood. We think of blood from an animal as something we have to kill that animal to access. But they look at blood the way we look at milk, or the way we look at giving blood. So what we traveled, it took days. Even from Nairobi, it took days. We had planes and traveling through the. We lost the road a long time before we actually even got to this village, and it was magnificent. It was so far to get in there, and we ended the trip down this dried riverbed. And I remember, and this is an important part of the conversation of the story, I remember coming up this dried riverbed. We had been traveling for a long time, and there were three. They were probably in their late teens, early 20s, Samburu warriors who were standing there waiting for us at the entrance to their village, right on the side of this dried riverbed. And they were backlit. The sun was behind them. It was sort of I was super excited to get there anyway after traveling for so long. But they just looked, I don't know another word, magnificent, beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that what they exhibited just by standing there, everything from their shape of their body to their posture, to their broad white smiles filled with white gleaming teeth, to their eyes that were white, everything about them just screamed health. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they look like the healthiest humans I have ever seen in my life. And I'm looking at them like, oh my gosh, this is like the epitome. This is what Michelangelo should be carving and painting. So anyhow, we follow them into the village, and they pulled a cow out of their herd and they just brought them over, led them over, and they tied a rope around its neck, just like we would do if we were giving blood, and they put the rubber band around our neck, and their jugular got large, just like our artery or whatever ever does as well. And they came over with this little tiny bow and arrow, and the arrow tip, it was metal, but it had a bunch of twine wrapped around it, so it would stop it from going in after about a quarter inch. It would only enter the animal about a quarter inch. So they walked over. It looked like a little toy bow and arrow, and they shot it right in its neck, and the arrow
How
goes in and
close do they
bounces
hold
out.
that? How close do they hold that arrow
Oh,
tip?
they were at 2 inches away.
Yeah.
I mean, it was right there. They didn't want to miss either, but they
Mm-hmm.
walked right up to it. They pulled this again. It looked like a bow from
Yeah.
it was a little stick. It
Mm-hmm.
didn't need to do much. So this arrow pops out, and all of a sudden blood is streaming out of the neck. And my youngest daughter was there, and she was sort of taken aback because not understanding what was happening, it looked like they just killed this animal. I mean, so this blood is spurted out, and they grab a gourd and they collected about a liter of it. And then as soon as they were done, they took the rope off its neck, and they picked up a little bit of dirt off the ground and threw it into the wound, and the animal walked off. And they'll do it again to that animal in a week or two. And they have a gourd full of blood, and they set it on the ground, and they picked a stick up right off the ground, and they stuck it in it, and they started stirring. And so anything coagulating would coagulate around that stick. And then they fed that to one of the dogs. And then they went over to another cow. They milked it real quick, about the same amount of fresh milk as they had with the blood. And then they dumped them back and forth in, the gourd to gourd to gourd to gourd, and mixed it together. And then we drank it. And I'll tell you, it tasted like it was warm, but a warm, rich, salty, sort of metally, irony chocolate milkshake. And what I
Yeah.
loved about it was that you felt like something was going into your body that was actually delivering nutrition. I mean, there was this level of satiation. You don't really get a level of satiation from drinking something, but you do with this. And it was magnificent. And the men and the boys, when they leave the village for about half the year during the dry season and just follow these animals, that's all they eat twice a day. Blood and milk, morning and night. The women and children eat it too, but they supplement with some other things as well. But what struck me so the entire experience was amazing, but coming home, what really struck me, I live in Maryland, and we get home and I'm thinking to myself, remembering that how healthy these people they just exuded healthiness. And right away, as soon as I get home, and we're engaging in different levels of conversations about health and diet, nutrition, and I realized that we're not even scratching the surface of what's possible. I mean, here I am in Maryland, and I just witnessed the healthiest people I've ever seen. And the two things that they eat literally every single day, one of them is illegal for me to get, and the other one is incredibly difficult for me to get.
Yeah, it's interesting, huh? We're living in kind of a food desert, even though we're all like, overeating ourselves to death. It's kind of shocking. Let's talk about how you broke this book up, because I really like this approach. You went, your chapters kind of go plants, animals, grains, maize, which gets its own. Maize is obviously a grain, but you give it its own chapter, which I think is worth really discussing. Dairy, I really love. You've got this chapter, bugs. This is something I'm a big believer in. And then even more so, you've got a chapter on geophagy after that, earth, ash, charcoal, which is something that I have seen to be a biological norm through, anthropologically through time, that gets left out of the food equation all the time. And then you have this chapter on sugar. I want to say for the listeners that you take a pretty non-dogmatic approach to all this, which is awesome. Just having been one of those kind of orthorexic people in my life who made everybody miserable around me because of my defining myself by what I didn't eat kind of story. So I really get, why you take that approach, but I kind of want to go through this and just talk about how you see these different food groups. First, I'll just, pass it back to you if anything you want to say about the layout here.
Yeah, originally it's funny. The layout, bugs was going to be much earlier in the book. What I was trying to do was I wanted to lay it out chronologically when these foods entered our diets in the past, and bugs have been there since the beginning,
all the way.
But I got a little pushback from readers because they thought that there was such an important story to tell here that if we threw something that is so foreign in the beginning so quickly, it might turn people off. And they actually wouldn't even finish the book. So we left it till later. So hopefully I was able to lay the foundation enough that people would continue to read and get to the bug chapter and then think about it. So other than that, and the geophagy, same thing. That's been I'm convinced, in our dietary past literally forever. But again, that was a little bit off the beaten path. So we kept that a little bit towards the end. So we have, plants, like you said, animals, which come in obviously after plants, grains. The reason I separated grains and maize was because the story about, and I'd love to talk it a little bit longer with you, but the story about the nixtamalization, the way you process the maize to make it as safe and nourishing as possible, was different than most of the other grains. So I felt it deserved its own chapter.
Right.
And then the final piece, the sugar. I wrote this. I did this work for the purpose of feeding my family. I mean, that's the quest I've been on for decades. And I realized that this was important enough information that I wanted to share it with as many people as I possibly could. And one of the things that I learned from being a father is that dogmatic approach sort of backfires sometimes. And there is, humans have modern day Homo sapiens appeared on this planet about 300,000 years ago. And I think make the case very strongly that from a biological perspective, to eat the most nourishing food possible to nourish our 300,000-year-old bodies, we should really go back to the diets that we had, that we were there when we first appeared. And I think that makes biologic sense. So if I knew what that diet was, and first of all, it wasn't one diet, and I don't know, and nobody knows exactly what it was 300,000 years ago, but even if I did, and I could convince everybody listening that that's the diet that would make you the healthiest human being on the planet, and served it to you, I might get you to eat it, and you might eat it tomorrow, and you might eat it the next day. But in about a week or two, you're going to stop it. And one of the reasons that's the case is because we humans don't eat for just biological health. We eat for cultural
Yep.
health and emotional health. So even though we're the same as we were biologically 300,000 years ago, well, for all intents and purposes, we are incredibly different, culturally, and we have very different emotional needs, and we have very different expectations of food that's wrapped up in all of that. So one of the there was a year in my life when I forget if I put it in the book or not, but there was a year in my life where there wasn't a food that came into our house that my children ate or my family ate that I didn't either forage, hunt for, at least butcher, and for sure there were no two ingredients put together in our house by somebody other than me. I mean, we made it all. It was a great learning experience for me, and I'm sure biologically my family was incredibly healthy, but they were all ready to kill me because
Mm-hmm.
it just didn't. So what I was able to do, I think, and I'm still struggling, as we all are, trying to find that line that really satisfies all of our needs to be the healthiest human being possible, which requires all of the biological and the cultural and emotional at the same time. And sugar, as you know, with me having kids, right now they're 18, 16, and 14, but when I wrote this was a few years ago. Was a constant battle in my house. And what I realized was that there's a way to do this that really makes sense. And that's why the sugar piece was added to it.
I talk a lot to people about how you have this. Yeah, I was watching. I know it's just a fictional film, but I was watching the extended cut of Dances with Wolves the other day,
There's an
and there's
extended cut.
it's like
Oh
4 hours, and you know what? Everything that they
wow.
cut out of it is all of the stuff with the Lakota people. So you get a lot more
Hmm.
language immersion. You see a lot more of the food processing. Like a lot of that stuff was taken out. But anyway, there's a scene where Kevin Costner first gives them some sugar. And you see this, I just love it because they really capture it right, where this guy who's never had refined sugar before puts it on his tongue, and he goes from this suspicious look to this like childlike smile. And I just feel like that's legit, right? Because you're built with this love and desire for sugar because of its scarcity, so that you'll seek it out because it is such a high nutrition food, but it's meant to be scarce.
Hmm.
Similarly, you touch a little cream to my tongue or a little oil, I get that same kind of like, oh yeah, like I want more of that fat.
Right.
Again, scarce and hard to get. So now we're in this funny situation where it's like people feel so guilty, and it's like, hey, look, don't. You're supposed to love these things. You're just not supposed to have so much access to these things. Like it's an
Yeah.
access problem, not like a personal failing. It's learning how to modulate yourself in an environment that's so rich and so dense in these kind of high caloric foods, I guess. So
I agree 100%. So what we do in our house, and what we do, my wife and I have a business called the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, where we actually bring this book to life, and we provide this food to the community, and we do workshops and classes, and it's all those things. And both here and at our home, the rule is with sugars, we just have a stance against refined sugars. So there's obviously no biological requirement for sugar. We can be incredibly healthy our entire lives and not eat any sugar whatsoever. But I do feel that sometimes it meets an emotional or cultural need, and if we're going to consume it, we might as well at least get something out of it, as at the same time. So completely unrefined sugars like muscovado, or we use really high quality honey, things like maple syrup, because when you're consuming them, you still get that pleasurable sweetness. But depending on what it is you're eating and the quality of it, you can get minerals, you can sometimes get vitamins, you can get enzymes. There's all sorts of other things that can come with it. And to me, that makes it worth it if we're doing it in moderation.
I have a couple acres of sugar bush here on my property, and I make maple syrup, and it's a challenge to figure out how to have a relationship to that. I look at it and I think about the tribes that lived here in the eastern woodlands
Hmm.
who, kind of invented that technology of making maple sugar. And I know this has an ancestral application. I love that it's a wild food. I love that any calories I eat from maple syrup are the blood of trees rather than something I get at the supermarket. So I love that that's, a filler for me of wild foods. At the same time, what I do now is I do a tablespoon a day in my morning smoothie, because it's like I have to have a measurement, because I could sit there just drinking maple syrup in my basement all day long,
Yeah,
and just get fat. I mean, I could just do that all day. I just love it. And
I do
like I said,
too.
I have to self-regulate. And I'm reading in your chapter, I'm like, hey, this checks all the boxes. It's unrefined. It's still mineral rich. I know there's manganese in there and all these nice little things, but like, it's sugar, and man, it's hard to stop. So yeah, that's interesting you say that. Also, it's fascinating. I'm sure you've delved in pretty deep into it, but looking at the traditions of sort of honey harvesting, wild honey harvesting in Africa, and seeing how highly people who get access to honey, how high they rate it in their I think it's the Hadza study, where they rate it as
Hmm.
their favorite food, both men and women. But it's just dangerous to get and scarce, right? So it's just like, maybe I need a little barbed wire or something around my stinging insects around my maple syrup stash.
Well, I harvested honey with the Hadza about 6 years ago, and I will tell you, they went bananas when they had access to honey. They were
That's
very
awesome.
good about sharing it with everyone, but it didn't take
Yeah.
long to consume every bit of it they had.
Yeah. I want to go back up to the top of the list though. So your
Sure.
plant chapter, I really, when I was reading it, I was like, okay, he got this right. I like this. One of the things people miss, especially today in the modern vegan communities, I love the title too, by the way, of the book itself, because I always joke with people I'm going to write a book called The Omnivore Diet, because it's always like, people are always like leaning either all the way carnivore or all the way vegan, and this weird like bifurcation of something that was obviously intertwined all in every culture that we can look at and that we have any ethnographies on. It's like nobody was vegan, and even the Inuit were not full carnivores.
Right.
Probably Inuit diets annually contain more plant species probably than the average American eats. So in a year. So looking at that, I like how you wrote it. You call it "Eat Like a Human," and I like when you get to plants that you sort of recognize, hey, plants need to be detoxified in many cases. There's this utopian idea that vegetarians have that you could just traipse through the Garden of Eden just picking plants and eating them. And it's like, when you go out into nature, you learn really fast, that's not reality. And many plants need a significant amount of processing and or detoxification, to make them edible. I think acorns for me are one of my prime examples. It takes me 10 days to render an acorn edible, through constant leaching and water changes and all this stuff. So talk to people about how the chapter's actually called Plants, Snacks, and the Sidewalk. Tell people about how you kind of see plants and how they fit in the role they play in our diet.
We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, if you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can now stream all 10 episodes on demand at myoutdoortv.com. Myoutdoortv.com is Outdoor Channel's premium online subscription service. They host thousands of episodes of hunting and fishing content, making this a great subscription service for anyone interested in the outdoors. But if you just want to see WildFed, grab yourself a free trial subscription and then check out all 10 episodes at no charge. If you decide to keep it, it's just $9.99 a month. We're currently in production for season 2 of WildFed, which is shaping up to be an awesome season of new episodes, and they'll start premiering on the Outdoor Channel in 2022. Hey, thanks again for all your incredible support. Now, back to the show.
Right. So and I first of all, let me back. I love the way that you started this part of the conversation, where yes, we need to recognize that this bipolar or bifurcated approach to eating is a brand new thing. It has only been in recent times that people are making the decision to eat all of one thing and nothing of another.
You could almost
It's
call it a
actually been.
fad diet.
It is. It is. It's an extended fad diet, and it's starting almost 3.5 million years ago, when we first started incorporating at least meat and probably and marrow into our diets. It's never been that way up until recent times. But prior to that, prior to our creation of our first stone tool and our ability to then scavenge dead animals on the savannah, we were eating plants and to the exclusion of meat, or at least to mostly the exclusion of meat. There's some suggestions by some anthropologists that our ancestors 5 to 7 million years ago might have been capturing small mammals, but even if they were, it wasn't a significant part of their diet. They were eating a limited amount of wild vegetables and fruits, and as you can imagine, hyper seasonal, hyper local, and only the ones that they could eat without engaging in some sort of detoxification strategy, other than maybe geophagy or eating soil or eating earth, and insects. We're confident they were eating
Thank you.
insects.
Thank you. Because I was sitting here going like, obviously we ate insects. You know?
Absolutely, and of those three things of fruits, vegetables, and insects. Insects were by far the most nutrient dense, the most bioavailable, and definitely the safest. And I
Amen,
start
brother.
off that plant chapter. I've been foraging for 38 years of my life now, and one of the reasons I wrapped foraging into the plants chapter, because there's a lot of obvious links, but one of them is, as you know, that connection that foraging gives you, that insight into the life of plants and the um, the need for understanding not only their life cycle but also how to detoxify plants or deal with plants in different ways to render them as safe and nourishing as possible is always there in foraging. But in shopping in the produce section of the grocery store, it doesn't give you, especially today's grocery store where there's no seasons and there's that you don't have that same connection. So I thought all of it went together well, and I started off that chapter with the statement, plants should scare the hell out of you. And that isn't to say we shouldn't eat plants. And it isn't an anti-vegetarian or anti-vegan statement. It is, we need to recognize that all plants have some level of toxin in them. Some of these toxins won't hurt you. Some of them, will kill you outright. And some of them, and the ones we really need to be worried about, will build up in your body over time and cause damage later. It could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years, it could be decades. And that's where the really scary ones are, because it's those toxins that when something happens, when they actually present in some sort of a problem for us, we have a hard time associating that problem with something that we had been eating, for 10 years or 20 years. And the other problem is when
Can you
something
give us an
comes.
example?
Oh, sure. Oxalates. I
Yeah,
talk about it in the
great.
book. Oxalates are a fantastic example. For those who are listening, oxalates they look like little tiny shards of glass under a microscope. And many plants have them. In fact, most plants
Most,
have them. Yeah,
yeah,
most
most
plants have
plants.
them. And unfortunately, some of our most celebrated plants that we identify as health foods or superfoods even have high levels of them, and
Yeah,
so we eat them in large quantities.
Popeye had kidney stones.
Popeye had that problems, but your body takes them and sequesters them and puts them in different places in your body to protect your body. But they'll build up and they'll build up and they'll build up, and sometimes they store them in your extremities, like your hands and your feet. Sometimes in joints. Sometimes in areas where you've had traumatic damage, and it can cause major problems later on. Things like kidney stones are a great example. If you've ever had those little bumps on your fingers or your hands, those deposits, that's a result of it. Often, gout is what's diagnosed as gout is actually something called pseudo gout, which isn't a uric acid problem; it's a calcium oxalate problem.
And these
And
crystals basically fall out of solution and just gravity drains them down to your feet, right? I mean, they
yeah,
just settle in
it,
your feet.
and there's the only thing you can do. I mean, some of the damage is irreparable. A lot of it is repairable, but you have to take a very low, eat a very, very low oxalate diet. Um, and they're incredibly painful. But the problem, and arthritic conditions, those sorts of things. But the problem is, and I'm convinced that a lot of our problems that we've normalized as getting old. Humans,
Yeah.
I'm getting old. I'm 40. It's hard to get out of bed in the morning. My feet hurt a little bit. It's achy walking up the steps. Like, oh, it's just getting old. And we just sort of have normalized it as a part of getting old. Well, it shouldn't be that way, right? If you look at other animals, not our domesticated animals, because we've screwed them up as much as we screwed ourselves up, but wild animals, they live incredible lives and then keel over dead. Like that's what life should be like. But we
We see that
now,
amongst a lot of indigenous peoples as well, where their diets are still
oh, sure,
traditional. You know
sure,
what I mean?
sure.
Their folks live long, long lives, and then it kind of all comes together right at the end.
But for the more domesticated of ourselves, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Of course.
it's something different, and we're like the last 10, 20, 30 years of our life, we're slowly dying and just
Hmm.
putting up with these things that we think are happening to us, but in fact a lot of it is the way that we're living our lives, and a lot of it is the food that we're eating. Just as an example of oxalates, it's things like spinach and almonds are incredibly high. Pine nuts, Swiss chard, kale, these are some of the ones we really have to be worried about. And potatoes are fairly high as well, and the list can go on and on. And I know for many people listening, oh my God, I drink a spinach shake every day because everybody says it's good. And if you're doing that, then I really think you should at least look up oxalates and start to pay attention to them.
You get some raw spinach in front of you. You start chewing on it. You immediately notice your teeth start to feel rough and pitted, and that's
Yep.
that's the oxalate pulling calcium out of the calcium phosphate matrix of your teeth. I mean, you can instantly feel it. And so it's funny because you were saying before, like somebody starting to get gout and they think, I better start eating healthier. I'm gonna start slamming those baby spinach salads or whatever. And it's like, oh no, it's exacerbating your problem.
If you have pseudo gout and they think it's gout, the very advice they tell you, the diet they tell you to eat is the exact opposite of what you should be eating. They're going to tell you to stay away from meat and any animal foods and eat massive quantities of plants. And it's the exact opposite. But here's how bad it is. This was a problem that, oxalate problems is a problem of these things building up in our bodies over time with diets that had moderate amounts of oxalates in them. And now it's becoming incredibly dangerous. So dangerous. There are people who are, if you ate spinach is very high in oxalates. The average serving of spinach, I forget how many times the amount of oxalates it should have in your body on a daily basis and how much your body can process. But if you ate spinach when spinach was in season, you'd get a dose of oxalates during that time, but then you'd have the rest of the year to detoxify at some
And
level.
by the way, that's like a week, maybe
Yeah.
2 weeks of that young meristematic, explosive early spring growth. And then there's nothing like that throughout the entire summer or fall again.
So it's sort of self-regulated, but now we have spinach getting shipped in all over the world. We have frozen spinach. We have access to spinach 365 days a year, and it's touted as this superfood. So now there's people making a spinach shake, sometimes with kale, which makes it worse, in almond milk every single morning,
Hmm.
and eating a spinach salad at lunch, and they're seeing dramatic effects. But this is so bad now that there was just a study a year and a half ago or so, where kids under the age of 10 for the first time ever are presenting with kidney stones, and it's happening in vegan families where the parents are replacing milk with almond milk. So the same amount of milk that a typical American child would be drinking on a regular basis, they're drinking in almond milk and just
Yeah.
flooding their body with oxalates.
And the long-term domestication of the plants that we eat has led, of course, to what appears to be a big variety, but really isn't. It's only like a handful of species, and they present in all these different phenotypes. I like to point out to people when you're looking at Brassica oleracea in the supermarket, you're seeing it as kale, collard, cabbage, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, rapini, and it looks like, oh, I'm eating all this variety. You're eating that one species, and it's got a goitrogen in it, and you could cook that, but the way that we've bred these plants to get rid of their bitterness and to get rid of any sulfuric compounds so that they seem edible raw, that allows us to then consume them raw, and then we end up bioaccumulating toxins. Whereas if we ate the wild form of this, we would just know, hey, I got to cook this thing. It's disgusting other. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
And
it's
we
allowed
can
us
allow ourselves, yeah.
to overconsume raw food. I mean, I came out of like a raw food vegan background, so I used to just slam these things, and now it's like very clear to me that I harvest wild foods. Like, oh, these things require cooking, and sometimes you don't think they do. Like spinach is a great example. You can mechanically eat it raw. It's just like if you pay attention to the signs and symptoms, you realize you probably shouldn't.
Absolutely. And I had that same, you mentioned that Garden of Eden idea. I used to have that same idea that if I was on, I'm going to get healthy now, the first thing you do is you go to the grocery store, you grab your cart, and in almost all grocery stores, the first section you walk into is the produce section. And I would just look up, and Garden of Eden is the perfect phrase. I'd look up and I think I'm in the Garden of Eden. This is where I need to be to get healthy. Some of this is good, more of this is better. Let me just load my cart, and without paying attention or thinking about all of the different ways that I should be approaching these plants in order to consume them as safely and in a way that actually allows my body to have access to the nutrients. I call it the can of soup effect, but we have this idea that if you looked at a can of soup, for example, just because it fits in your hand, and if you turn, if you can picture turning the can of soup in your hand and looking at the nutrient label on it, and it says this many calories, this much fat, this much protein, this much whatever. We have that idea, I think, that if you open that can and dumped it down our throats and we swallowed it, that all of those nutrients magically get to where they need to be in our bodies. But that's not the case.
Yeah.
I think it was Stephen Gundry who wrote about our digestive tract, compared it to the Lincoln Tunnel, and said, your digestive tract is like the Lincoln Tunnel. You enter it in New Jersey, and the only thing that you can guarantee is that you're going to exit in New York. You don't go into the Hudson River.
Yeah, that's great.
So this food has to be in the right state, and your body has to be healthy for the nutrients that you're consuming to be absorbed and used properly by our bodies. So just because a plant says it has something in it, right, and you consume that plant, doesn't mean that nutrient is getting used by your body. In fact, in many cases, it's in a form that it can't, and it goes right through your digestive tract and ends up in.
Or it's side by side with an anti-nutrient that inhibits the absorption. So maybe you've got too many tannins, so now you're not taking up, positively charged, mineral ions or whatever it is. I want to, before we move on, because I want to talk about animals here, but I want to ask you about your thoughts on fiber. My friend Paul Saladino has been on the show, and we don't really agree on plants so much, but
no, you don't.
But I really love it. I love a lot of the perspective he's bringing. I tease him about the fad diet that he's pushing, but he feels that fiber has been highly overrated. I'm not convinced. I sort of feel, my current perspective is that fiber is a substrate for our microbial biome, and it seems to me pretty universally found in the human diet. So anyway, I want to get your thoughts. Do you agree, disagree? Do you think fiber is important? Do you think it's overstated? What's your position on all that?
I do think fiber is overstated, but I do think I think it's very important. And I'll tell you two reasons why. One is I completely agree that the prebiotic, benefits of fiber are incredibly important. And I'll also say for any indigenous or traditional group that I've spent a lot of time with, they are consuming plants that have very high levels of or high loads of fiber in them. In fact, in many cases, the level of fiber in these plants are something that if we were to eat them, we'd probably get turned off. They're so fibrous. So I can't imagine. I look to the past for most of my answers of the questions I have about eating and nutrients and sustainability and ethical approaches to living in the world and things like this. And if you look into the past, I can't find evidence for people trying to consume a low fiber diet. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The plants that they're consuming have very high amounts of fiber in them.
And a lot of times that's soluble fiber too, especially if they're getting, like I'm thinking of Arctic peoples eating a lot of berries, and those berries are really high in pectins, like those soluble fibers that seem to play an important role too. Yeah, I'm curious. I just, so before we move on to animals, give people your sort of 50,000 foot view on plants. So if people are listening to this going like, wait, should I not eat plants? Or wait, the plants I'm eating aren't good. Help people to kind of get a sense of what you're suggesting that they do when it comes to the plants in their diet.
Sure. So I think humans are omnivores by technology. We're not. We know that we're omnivores, but we think we're omnivores by design, and that is not the case. We are omnivores because we've figured out ways of approaching food and creating technologies to process that food and deal with it to make it as safe and nourishing as possible. So that really is the case with plants. And if you look at the role of technology is even more important with plants than it is with animals. With animals, if you can create a technology that allows you to harvest an animal, a trap, a bow, an arrow, an atlatl, a spear, whatever it is, and have a sharp edge to open that animal, that's about as far as you need to go with technology. The rest of it you can do by yourself. And you're looking at a massive amount of nutrient-dense bioavailable food. Plants are the opposite. It's fairly easy, not easy, but to harvest wild plants. You might need a digging stick or you might need a sharp, but you can access these plants. The problem is accessing the nutrition in a safe and nourishing way. And when I say, the reason I started out that chapter with, plants just scare the hell out of us, it's not about fear, it's more about respect and understanding.
Yeah.
You need to understand that, plants are there. Most of them have some sort of an issue, and if you're going to eat plants, do so with knowledge about that plant. Some of these plants are fine raw, and I don't mean just wild plants, domesticated plants you find in the grocery store. Some of these are fine raw. Some of these require me to do something to extract the most amount of nutrition from them. And sometimes that's cooking, sometimes that's slicing, sometimes that's fermentation, whatever it is. Sometimes it's eating it with something else. And then some of these plants, certainly in the field and in the wild, but definitely also in the grocery store, I would just stay away from. There's some that are just not, even if they may have nutrition, I still would stay away from them because it's not worth it. And to me right now, I think the biggest one that's starting to rear its ugly head because of getting rid of seasons in the grocery store and because of championing some of these plants that I don't think we should champion, like spinach. The one right now I think we need to be paying attention to are the oxalates. And those are the easiest ones to find information on.
And they sure are a lot in the leafy greens. All right, let's talk about animals. I love the name of this chapter, More Animals, Less Meat. That's just brilliant. Honestly, I mean, you summed something up that I think is normally, it takes a lot more lip service to kind of flesh out. So tell people what you mean by that. So that's just great.
Yeah, and I was kind of playing off that idea that everybody's suggesting now, not everybody, but many people that are environmentally and health conscious are suggesting that we should be eating less meat. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, right? That we eat massive quantities of meat, especially here in the United States. But what we're not eating, and what the part of the animal that was central to our diets and these diets that created us as humans, is the rest of the animal, the stuff we don't see on the grocery stores. So what I'm suggesting is that, yeah, we eat less meat, but we eat more of the rest of the animal that we're usually not consuming. So the numbers really are about, by weight, 55% of a pig and about 50% of a cow make it to the grocery store shelves. The rest of that, the stuff that we consider offal, blood, fat, organs, those sorts of things, end up in other places. Sometimes they get tossed, sometimes they get used for dog food, sometimes they get used as fertilizer. There's a lot of different uses for them, except for our human diet. And if you look at, and here's what I think is incredibly important. And this is one of the things that I really like. You mentioned Paul Saladino earlier. He is one of the carnivores that's actually championing eating the entire animal. Which I love, because a lot of that gets missed in the carnivore.
Yeah, a lot of these folks are just eating steaks all the time.
Yeah.
It's like pretty imbalanced, man.
And look, if somebody's eating a really junky diet and turn to the carnivore diet, they will see incredible improvements. That is, there's no doubt. But I think there's a little bit missing with it as well, and one of them is the organs. If we're looking to the past to try to have suggestions on how we should be approaching our food today, it is incredibly. We have this idea: caveman eating meat. This is big clubs and those sorts of things, and the kind of access to animals people had in the past is completely different than our access now in the Acme or the ShopRites. Right? Most of us, when we go to the grocery store today, will go and buy the same cut from the same 3 animals week after week after week after week. And unfortunately for so many people, it's just chicken breast. But for some people, it's filet or it's sirloin or a T-bone steak or whatever it is. And it's the same cut over and over and over again. There is nothing natural about that whatsoever. That does not emulate anything that happened in the past. Now, it is important to understand that about 3.5 million years ago, our ancestors created our first stone tool, and we have evidence for that same time period from on archaeological sites where there's cut marks on the bones that show that they were hacking flesh with these stone tools off the bone and then either consuming it or bringing it to people back at camp or whatever.
This is Australopithecus afarensis you're talking about at this point. We're going way back here,
yes,
3.5
this
million
is
years.
well before Homo. So this is,
Yep.
we think it's Australopithecus afarensis or Australopithecus africanus.
Yep.
Given
Okay.
where these sites are and the time period. So we're talking about our ancestors that full-blown upright adults about 3.5 feet tall with brains a little bit smaller than my fist. So their nutritional requirements were not that high, but they were thrilled to get meat because for millions of years they're eating a little bit of wild fruits and vegetables and some insects, and now they can introduce meat. They're not hunting. They are scavenging from the African savanna after predators, the ancestors to modern day lions and those sorts of animals with huge canines, would jump on these animals, rip them apart, and do what predators on the African savanna do still today. They'll go in and eat the blood, fat, and organs and go gorge themselves. And like we do at Thanksgiving, after we've gorged ourselves, we go off on a couch and sleep and watch the football game, and they go off on a rock and sleep. And they leave these carcasses covered in flesh that they haven't gotten to yet. Sometimes they leave them for good. Sometimes they come back later on. But when they leave them, it provides an opportunity for animals that are adapted to scavenging. Things like ancestors to modern day buzzards or ancestors to modern day hyenas would go in there and they would have a field day with all of the flesh that's still hanging on these animals. But our ancestors couldn't do that because they didn't have anything that allowed them to. They had these incredibly weak nails and these incredibly inefficient teeth and no huge canines and couldn't do anything. But when they created that stone tool, they could. But what's important to understand, and we have these conversations about food categories that just the way that we frame the discussion and the vocabulary we use inhibits us from having a real discussion. They go in and they get meat. Our discussions today about eating animals and whether we should be eating animals or plants and this and that is always the word we always use is meat because that's what we're used to in the grocery store. But what's fascinating is that meat enters our diet at about 3.4 million years ago, and nothing really changes. We have a little bit of brain growth, a little bit of body growth, but for 1 million years, not much changes. A million and a half years. It isn't until 2 million years ago when we think we invented technology for hunting, which is also, by the way, the same time that we, at least I and many people like Richard Wrangham believe that we are able to control fire, that we see massive body and brain growth. In fact, the most massive body and brain growth that we see in our ancestral past, and it's to almost modern proportions, which the difference between scavenging and hunting is when you're scavenging, you only have access to meat. When you're hunting, you're the predator. You have first access to all the different parts of the animal. In fact, you have first access to the parts that the predators 3.5 million years ago were gorging themselves on, the blood, the fat, and the organs. And if many people in the nutritional and dietary space focus on things like nutrient density and bioavailability. So nutrient density, how many nutrients are there in this, one package of food? And then bioavailability, are those nutrients available to our bodies? And if those two things are important, which I'm convinced they are, the blood, the fat, and the organs are the most nutrient-dense bioavailable parts of an animal. And in fact,
No question.
the flesh is one of the least nutrient-dense parts of the animal. It's incredibly nutrient-dense compared to insects, not necessarily with insects, but certainly with plants. So think that is fascinating to me. At 2 million years ago, we begin to become human as we know it today. There's many people that believe this because we are accessing the blood, the fat, and the organs from these animals that we're harvesting at will on our own. And meanwhile, you can't even find that stuff in most grocery stores.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm talking about. So the cool
if you
part
do
is,
too, sometimes it's funny. You got like a little cooler over in the corner where there's some liver in there, and it's like they're basically giving it away.
yeah,
you go buy like a quart of chicken livers, and it's like 99 cents, and it's like it's all like freezer burned and like stuck off in some corner. It's like, how twisted have we gotten in our thinking?
The easiest place to find chicken liver in most places is next to the worms in the bait section.
Yeah, it's true.
And the worms are probably better than most of them in the grocery store. But if you think about if we go back to that half of the animal in the grocery store shelves, now knowing that the blood, the fat, and the organs are the most nutrient dense part of the animal, that 50%, that half of the animal that doesn't make it to the grocery store shelves, doesn't just represent half of the nutrition that animal has an opportunity to provide. It represents more than half of the nutrition that animal has the opportunity to provide. So what kills me is that we frame these conversations, vegan, carnivore, we want to be ethical, we want to be sustainable, we want to be healthy, all these things on the idea that what's in the grocery store shelves as a product of the modern industrial meat industry is on one side of the equation, and then there's something else on the other. And that's not the only answer. If you are talking about eating the entirety of the animal, and where you see most indigenous and traditional groups, and even the archaeological record suggesting that 90% is like a minimum of what they're using from these animals. And I know the Sami in northern Scandinavia are eating like 98% of these animals for food. All of those equations change. The entire argument and conversation changes.
Mm-hmm.
So from nutrition to the ethical approaches to animals. I mean, now we're using almost 100% of this animal as food to nourish ourselves and our families. The sustainability.
You'd almost be cutting it in half, right? Like you'd be cutting the number of animals in half that need to be brought into the food market if we ate the whole. I just had a guy on from Australia who is doing this with fish. He's saying with fish we're getting a 45% yield. He's got it up to 90%, but it's like, if you want to reduce the amount of fish that have to come out of the ocean, one way to do it is to double the amount that you use. And this is also true of land animals, obviously.
Yep. And then the final piece, and you mentioned it earlier, was the economic piece, both for the farmers. I mean, think about a small scale farmer that's doing an incredible job with their animals. And now all of a sudden they have a market for almost 100% of that animal, as opposed to just the 50% they're selling. I mean, they'll get $10 for the hide, and they'll get, whatever but a real market. And on the consumer end, here we are with, if you're shopping on a budget and your goal is to feed your family the most nourishing food possible, what better than to incorporate, those offcuts or the organs into your shopping cart, and at a much better price. There's no drawback whatsoever.
When I harvested my bison recently, one thing that really struck me, because the Dakota people that I was with, they're obviously very far removed from their traditional life way, and kind of living in a bit of a food desert. But when a buffalo's harvested, they say buffalo, when a bison's harvested, people still like to eat the liver raw. And I was really impressed with that. Like, people who weren't part of our hunting party, we had brought our animal up to this area to cut it. And some folks just kind of walked up and they were like, can we have some raw liver? And then we're all sitting there eating raw liver together. And I thought that was really interesting that has so many of the traditions have been lost, of course, but that remains. That's still understood. And so that piece of organs is really interesting to me. And what we did with that was we ground about 10% by volume of liver into all of our ground bison, so that we're eating bison burger meat, we're eating liver. I just think it's a great way to do it, because a lot of people are a little adverse now to the richness of liver. But I wanted to ask you too, because another thing that happened, I did a pretty deep dive into bison ecology as it relates to, human hunting, and became very clear that meat was the last thing that traditional bison hunters were after. Fat was their primary motivation. And, you see that when you watch, I don't know if you're a student of the show Alone. Do you watch that at all?
Yeah, I know some people that have been on it. So yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I was talking to Jordan Jonas recently, and he's got the real famous moose kill, and you see what happens when he lost the kidney fat, got stolen by a wolverine, and he's got a whole moose and he's starving to death on that meat. Like, that's not the whole thing, right? So there's the bone marrow, there's the different types of fats, saturated and unsaturated, that are in different parts of the carcass. And then I wanted to ask you your thoughts on, do you think there's anything to this glycine methionine balance? Because I think of it like, I love eating backstrap and, having tenderloin. I mean, it's lovely to have steak like that. But I also really like to eat a deer neck, where I've got to cook that thing down until it breaks down and I'm eating all of that collagen and all of that gelatin. And I always think about that as balancing lean meat, like that I need to get the sort of dominant aminos from both of ends of that equation. So curious your thoughts on that. You think there's anything to that?
Actually, I need you to tell me what that is. I'm not
Oh
that
yeah. So
balance.
that was presented to me was that when you're eating like lean meat, you're getting a methionine rich meat, and then when you're eating things that are high in collagen that normally need to be braised, that they're glycine rich. And
Huh.
it's been presented to me that too much methionine in imbalance with glycine can maybe is a precursor to some cancers. So I don't know if that's true or if you know, but I have found, like you're saying, it's really easy, and you see this with a lot of modern hunters. They want to take all that meat that can be eaten as steak, and they're not necessarily wanting to eat, you know, those
Right.
shoulder cuts. They're not wanting to eat those neck cuts. And then, you know, you look at traditional peoples. I mean, they're boiling hooves and eating the moose nose and you know all these
Oh,
kind of things. So, right, the whole
the
animal. Yeah.
eating the entire, I did I'm working on a series of videos. This was last year for, I've been asked a bunch for how do, let me back up. A lot of the hunters around here are two generations now into just breasting geese and ducks, and they're taking their deer to get them processed, and they're getting, I don't even know if they're getting their deer back, but they're
Yeah.
only getting the
They're
meat
getting their
back.
sausage sticks back or whatever.
Yeah, they're getting somebody's. Yeah, so they're really, we've been working on it here really hard, and there's a lot of people that really want to make a change, but a lot of it starts, as you know, in the field. How you field dress an animal, how you prepare if you're going to keep
Hmm.
different parts of it, and then how you use these different parts of the animal, whether it be liver or heart or kidney or fat or marrow or whatever. So I was just finishing up a series of videos that I was doing on field dressing animals, with the idea of approaching it from a complete nose to tail, and then some cooking things after it. And I had spent weeks and weeks and weeks working on this. And I had in the background, I had just, if you don't know it, I can send you a link to it. There's a book written by Sami youth up in northern Scandinavia who are reindeer herders, uh, and the youth from different villages. They wrote this cookbook on reindeer, and I had it. I downloaded it. You can only get it on a PDF, and I downloaded it. But I didn't have any time to look at it. And the last day of filming was on a Saturday, and I literally finished filming. My reward was going to be to read this book, or start reading the book. And I don't know if literally, but at least figuratively, patted myself on the back for, like, man, we just used, all the parts of all these animals. And I was so proud of myself, and showed people. And then I opened up this PDF and started reading it. And I immediately was embarrassed. I mean, immediately,
Yeah.
immediately humbled. I
Yeah.
mean, they're eating the trachea. I mean, they're eating
Yeah.
everything. But
Everything. Yeah.
but it was so profound, because I had just spent weeks setting up and how to use this entire animal, and there were things even from that mindset that I
Yeah.
didn't consider food, that not only do they consider food, but they cherish.
Yeah, there's some balance here because I find that the desire to use the whole animal can be such a barrier to entry for new hunters that I
Hmm.
try not to make people feel too guilty about that because it's so overwhelming when you're first starting. And then at the same time, it's like the more of this we can do, the healthier we are, the less we need to hunt. Therefore, the less pressure we're putting on the environment. So, trying to find that balance. I ate a bluefin tuna heart the other day on the boat. It was I'd been working really hard to get this bluefin. We finally got one, and people are saying, "Well, you got to take a bite of the heart." And I'm like, "Is this a joke? Are you guys joke?" Like, I felt like they were playing a joke on me, but I was like, I ate it. It's fantastic, like that, just so good. I just think it's really funny. But it's taken me some time to get over it. One quick question I have for you. I almost never mess with brains, and it's because I got this just primal aversion to this. These prion diseases that obviously are not super pervasive throughout the environment and not always, something humans can contract. But I look at brain, I feel brain, and I go like, that's DHA. Like that's, you talk about fish oil, man, brains, like but I never eat them because I'm just concerned, like maybe I should not mess with these neurological issues. So your thoughts on brain, is it a food for you or is it something you don't mess with?
It is. I have the same sort of concerns as you do. In fact, I do a lot of brain tanning, and I go so far. So the deer make me a little bit nervous. There's only been a couple of cases here in Maryland, and it's all been on the western side of the state. And I'm on the eastern side of the state. But even when I'm brain tanning deer skin, I use pig brains for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So I don't mess with deer brains right now, and I certainly don't mess with cow brains. But we do consume brains, especially from pigs in our house. We'll do some bird brains as well. We don't do it regularly, but it is a nutritional powerhouse, and I'm
Man, isn't
convinced with
it?
something. I mean, nutritional powerhouse, and
Yeah.
actually, I think quite delicious, and a texture that I like as well.
It's pudding, man.
Yeah, but I do have the same worries as you do.
It's a bummer because you know that the CWD is going to eventually, it's going to be around the whole continent, if not the world. It's just a matter of
Yeah.
time, and it's a it's a sad thing. Let's talk real quickly about your grains chapter. I really want to get to the piece on maize. I'm just, as a North American, born in North America, this to me, maize is the food. It's like the grain of our continent here. So I'm really fascinated by it, but I don't want to skip too quickly over wheat and sourdough and their cousins, your chapter there. So talk to us about basic processing. This used to be very well understood, even up until recent times, but has
Yeah.
just really slipped away.
No, I think it's incredibly important for everyone to understand the different roles of. We talk about plants and the different roles that different plants and different plant parts have. They're not here to feed us. They're here to survive and reproduce viable offspring like every other species on the planet. They're not here to feed us. But there are parts of plants that are designed to attract, and there's parts of plants that are designed to ward off predation. And there's also parts of plants that are designed to help with that reproduction in a number of different ways. So flowers are designed to attract, certainly. Fruits are designed to attract, and it's rare that you would find heavy toxin loads, although they exist certainly. But for parts of plants that they want to be eaten or want to be messed with, they're usually sweet smelling and brightly colored and tasting good and all those sorts of things. But seeds, right? Seeds, nuts, legumes, all of grains, they are there. They're designed to reproduce, right? And
Hmm.
they're most of them are designed to last through our digestive tract and get deposited somewhere else in a pile of manure. So to even consider them as food, something that's designed to not get broken down in our digestive tract, is a leap, right? And I know we don't mostly think of it that way because we look at a loaf of bread and we just see a loaf of bread and want to put some butter on it. But the root of that bread, that grain, was something that's designed chemically and physically, right? The shape of it is designed so that it goes through our digestive tract without getting hung up in most cases. And chemically, as we mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of anti-nutrients and phytates and lectins and all sorts of things
It's
that
made to
help
come
that.
out in New York without getting into the Hudson River.
Absolutely. and and it won't germinate until it's in the right state. And the reason it won't germinate is because the chemicals that it produces are there to help it stay safe and help it stay dormant. So if we're coming at it from that perspective, then the answer shouldn't be how, should I be eating grains or not? It should be like everything else. How can I eat grains in the
Hmm.
safest and most nourishing way possible? And I think that's how we should approach all of our food. And in order to do it properly, we need to trick the nuts, the seeds, the legumes, whatever, into thinking that it's in the right state to germinate. In some cases, maybe even germinate it, and then a lot of those toxin loads will, not all of them, but a lot of them will reduce to the point where it's a much safer food for us to consume, and it also will give up its nutrition a lot easier. Now, the difference between there's a lot of differences between most of the bread in the grocery stores and sourdough bread, but let's just say that they were made with the same exact ingredients, right? And most bread is flour, water, salt, and if it's a modern bread, it's at least yeast. And let's say we have a loaf of sourdough bread made from exactly the same things. The difference is not in the important difference for this conversation is not in the ingredients, it's in the process.
Hmm.
So when we make and most people know this way, if you ever made bread and if you add yeast to it, there's a yeast fermentation that's eating the carbohydrates, producing carbon dioxide and alcohol. The alcohol gets burned off when you're cooking the bread, but the carbon dioxide is what makes that bread expand and get its nice fluffy holes on the inside. But as far as nutrition is concerned, not much is changing through that process. Sourdough bread, on the other hand, requires at least two fermentations. Yeast fermentation to do exactly what the modern yeast is doing in the modern bread, and also a lactic fermentation in which the lactobacillus bacteria are chemically and physically transforming those grains and the proteins in those grains into something completely different. A lot of things happen through that process. Again, chemically and physically are changing. It is not only, it helps reduce the toxin load of the grains that are in there. It helps break them down so that the nutrients in those grains are easier for our bodies to deal with. And it's transforming things like gluten, which causes so many of us so many problems, into something that is a little bit easier for our bodies to deal with. And that lactic fermentation is the important part. I think the earliest bread now is ever discovered, or bread-like thing, is almost 14,000 years old. And up until, modern yeast was discovered in the mid 19th century. So the majority of that time we've been eating, the vast majority of time we've been eating bread, it has been a natural combination of wild bacteria and yeast that exist in the air, on our hands, on the flour grains, all around us, that are responsible for producing both of those fermentations. So the bread isn't just getting leavened and getting big and getting soft, but the grains are chemically and physically changing into something that's safer and more nourishing for our bodies to deal with. We own a sourdough bakery, my family does, and we have so many customers that can't eat normal modern bread, but have absolutely no issues eating our bread. And just as a quick, to put some math to it, a quick little side note, for people who are worried about things like diabetes and glycemic index of foods, and this really, I love this. I mentioned it in the book. This really brings to light the difference in just the processing method, more so than even the ingredients sometimes. Bread that is just yeasted, whether or not it's 100% white bread or 100% whole wheat bread or a combination of the two, has a very high glycemic index. Usually, the glycemic index, anything above 70 is considered high, and that obviously measures your blood sugar response to the foods that you're eating. Pure glucose is 100, and modern bread is above in the 70s range. That same exact ingredients put through the sourdough process drops it to below 55, which puts it in the low range. And again, that transformative, and the only difference is the way that the bread is made.
It's like thinking about sauerkraut, though, right? It's like you have your cabbage is your prebiotic food, and then you've got your cultures like your probiotic, and you put them together and you end up with the sauerkraut's the symbiotic. So you're taking the wheat or whatever ingredient, and you're taking that culture, and the bread that you're producing is a symbiotic. It's like sauerkraut. It's a fermented food at that point, and it's now something synergistic. It's no longer just the sum of its ingredients. It's something transformed. It's something new. That's really cool to think about.
It's something new that's old. I mean, that's the other. It's something different, but it's something that we've had in our diets forever. Right. And this is where we mentioned earlier that term meat. I hate using the word meat when we're discussing, having a conversation about whether we should be including animals in our diet or not. It makes a big difference. And then when we start to get to conversations about whether or not humans should be eating bread, well, what do you mean by bread? Are you talking about a Wonder Bread? No, absolutely shouldn't be in our diets at all, but a real high quality old world sourdough loaf of bread, I would make the argument that can be part of a healthy human diet.
It's interesting too if you were looking at two loaves of non-sourdough bread, but like let's say you had a pure white bread and you had a whole wheat bread. It's arguable which is worse or better for you, because when you're looking at the white bread, you're like dealing with just that refined sugar, basically that refined complex carbohydrate and very little nutritional value. But you look at the brown bread and it's like most people think, oh, that's healthier, but that's where all that phytic acid and all those anti-nutrients are in that brown part. So it's like if you haven't leached that or transformed that through soaking or sprouting or whatever, you almost are doing more of a disservice to eat the whole wheat bread than you are. I don't know which. They're both not great, but it's kind of an interesting thing. It's not as so cut and dry as like, oh, well, that one's, got more nutrition, and it's like, oh, it's got more anti-nutrition too. So, neither are a great choice. Let's talk about the nixtamalization process with corn. That is just a fascinating, I am a big fan of masa, and we make a lot of tortillas here, and using a purple corn masa. But last year was the first time I actually did the whole process from scratch. It's a bit time consuming, but it's fascinating to watch how things transform and what you can make. So talk to us about how that benefits us. And for those who don't realize, like, you don't just take straight ground cornmeal and make tortillas. It doesn't work. That won't
No.
stick together. So talk to people about what our ancestors, or at least those in North America, understood about maize.
So yeah, maize was domesticated probably. Now, there's some early dates, but probably between 8 and 10,000 years ago at least. And this was the mainstay of so many diets. The Maya, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, the Incas. It wasn't like they ate a whole bunch of other stuff and a little bit of maize. They ate a massive amount of maize and some other stuff.
And it
And
had made its way up to you and even to me here in Maine about 4,000 years ago. It was here in Maine. So this, right along some of our rivers here were huge plantations of maize. So, this food was village by village adapted all the way across much of North America and South
one
America.
100%, and was so important not only nutritionally but was the basis of so much religion and culture that
Hmm.
I mean, it permeated every aspect of society. It was incredibly important, and the way they dealt with it, they did it. Anyone eating maize prehistorically seemed to have been doing a very good job of using it as a basis for their diets. But everything changes when the early explorers who came to America and saw the maize and took it back to Europe. Everything's changed when they took it with them, and huge problem, a disease called pellagra, which is a deficiency of niacin in the diet, followed. You could actually trace the spread of maize throughout Europe with this disease following in its wake. And the problem with maize is that the problem is also a benefit. It tastes good. It's incredibly filling. It's incredibly easy to grow in the same kind of latitudes that we see much of Europe and we see much of the Americas in. And when it comes into areas that are either impoverished or are need need better food access, it tends to dominate the diets. So people who may have been hungry before maize came in were getting their food from a variety of sources. But when maize comes in, it dominates the diet to the exclusion of the other foods that they were in their diets. And this disease, pellagra, again, follows. It was first identified in Spain, then later in Italy, where it gets its name pellagra, which means sour skin, and then eventually throughout Europe. We see it again at the end of the Irish potato famine when the U.S. Ships over massive quantities of maize as famine relief food. And then most recently, well, not most recently, but in the US, we see it in the 1920s, 1930s in the American Southeast, where there's massive quantities of corn, especially or maize in poor areas being consumed. And it may not sound like a very big deal, but over that time, we have literally millions of people getting sick and hundreds of thousands dying, even here in the US. And the sort of ironic part of all of this is that this is a disease of because there's a niacin deficiency in the diet and maize has niacin in it. So here we are for several hundred years, millions of people getting sick, hundreds of thousands of dying while eating because of a nutrient deficiency, while eating massive quantities of a food that has that nutrient. It's that can of soup effect that we mentioned earlier. It's that niacin is not in the proper state. It's something called niacin inside of that maize. It's not in the right state for our bodies to do anything with, and our bodies can't make use of it. It passes right through our bodies. So this doesn't
Might
seem to
be
have
the
been a problem.
origin of the term redneck, right? They say
It
that,
actually is. Yeah,
yeah.
we're not only redneck, but when it appears in Eastern Europe, it's the same. So here's the symptoms. You get red rashy skin, lesions, and then things start falling off of your, stuff is falling off of your skin, and sometimes in the early stages gets misdiagnosed as leprosy, and then later on. You're bleeding from your mouth. You have an aversion to sunlight. Eventually go blind, and then you die. And at the time that this appears first in Eastern Europe is the same time that people are coming up with these ideas about vampires. And there's some suggestions that
Mm,
the bleeding from the mouth, the aversion to sunlight,
yeah.
unexplained, this brand new thing that's unexplained is getting explained in the literature through this idea of vampires. But yeah, the term redneck comes from it because if you are in the sun, the areas of your skin that's exposed get very, very red. And
And of
this is
course, this is
happening.
people who are growing corn and eating a diet of corn, but they're not nixtamalizing it. They're not treating it the way it was treated traditionally.
Right. And again, the same that this is this is a problem we created by not processing the food properly. It's kind of like
Hmm.
all these issues we're having with bread now because we're skipping the sourdough part of the process. We're eating massive quantities of maize now without putting it through the process, the same process that the traditions that grew up around maize, first domesticated maize, and then grew up around it for thousands and thousands of years and learned how to deal with it in the safest, most nourishing way possible. We're skipping that. Now you can get it. No, so well, let's explain what it is very quickly. So prehistorically, um, first of all, we're confident this has been around for at least 4,000 years as a technology. We see it in the archaeological record. But what's super promising is just about a year and a half ago, we developed a technique to directly identify it in the archaeological record. In other words, we can look at an archaeological site and tell whether or not that the maize has been nixtamalized by looking at the maize. So I'm pretty confident that given the long prehistory of maize, that date that we were using
Will
the
get pushed
nixtamalization
back
probably
further
goes
and
pushed
further.
back and back. But originally, all it really means is you take the maize, the hard. So for anyone listening, I know most of us when we think corn, think about corn on the cob, but I'm talking about corn or maize. It's more like feed corn, like dent corn, the stuff you'd put out to feed deer with. That kind of the hard stuff you see in Halloween that you hang on your door. Those dried kernels you put in an alkaline solution or a basic solution, which traditionally was done with water and wood ash, or a substance calcium hydroxide that you can dig out of the ground, and it makes it basic. It raises the pH, and you bring it to a boil, you simmer it, bring it to a boil, simmer it for about a half an hour or so. Turn off the heat or put the fire out, cover it, and let it sit overnight. That's literally all you have to
Hmm.
do. And then the next day you rinse off the skins, which are now really really mushy, and what you have at that point is what's called nishtamal, or some people refer to it as hominy. And then if you grind it, you turn it into masa dough or masa flour, and then you can make tortillas or a drink called atole or um, tamales, which is where the name comes from
Mm.
nixtamalization, and that's
Making me
it.
hungry.
So, but you say that because I think for both of us who've really eaten the real versions of this, not only does it change the nutritional availability of the nutrients that are in the maize, but it changes the flavor and the
Yeah,
texture
the
and the
texture.
smell in very positive ways. So if you've never had a real tortilla, go find one. And if you don't have somebody that's doing this, do it yourself. You can do it in your house. All you need to do is go to Walmart and buy pickling lime and get the maize. I have instructions in the book. We actually now do it here. We're on the eastern shore of Maryland. It's a fairly rural area, and nobody around here is making it. So we make it every week. We do about 10 kilos worth of dried
Yeah,
maize, turn them into
yeah.
tortillas.
Yeah, it's cool because it renders it into a more useful culinary food. You get that nice stickiness to it and all of that, so makes it more useful anyway. But I think a lot of people will look on a bag of corn chips or something and they'll see lime and they probably assume the ingredient means lime, the citrus fruit, and don't understand that this is from that process. I used to always be confused when I was younger about that. I'd see that on there in a lot of corn products like lime, like I didn't understand at the time, but that's fascinating, and you can imagine with the way human beings cooked over wood fires, that how this would have been discovered eventually, just due to the contamination of wood ash. You can kind of imagine people figuring this out over time, but that's fascinating because at that point, so let's follow that all the way through. So at that point, the niacin whatever's there, that precursor's converted to niacin, and now you have
And it's soluble by our bodies, yes.
okay, yeah,
And
that's so
there's an
cool.
increase because of it, because of the calcium hydroxide in the processing with it. There's an increased amount of calcium in the final product as well. Other nutrients are released, and it's just easier for our body to access those nutrients. Another great example is grits. Prior to the Civil War, grits were made from nixtamalized maize, and for convenience and a variety of other factors that are difficult to truly understand, we really in the U.S. just stopped doing it, and it's very rare that you can find grits today that are made through that nixtamalization process. But as we just talked about for the past 10 minutes, they result in completely different foods, not only in taste and texture and aroma, but also in nutrition.
I want to. I wish we had more time today. I'd love to have you back on the show because I feel like there's so much we could talk about. I want, you've got your dairy chapter and your insect chapter, but I kind of want to jump ahead to this
Sure.
piece of earth, ash, and charcoal because you're talking right now. Obviously when we talk about lime, we're talking about calcium carbonate is a very common mineral on the earth and used in a lot of food processes around the world. But this idea of eating earth is fairly widespread, and I'm fascinated by. I just had somebody talking to me the other day about we we were talking about having freezers. As hunters, you're always talking about like what's going on in your freezer, and we were talking about when you've got to clean the frost off. And this person says to me, "Oh, when my mom was pregnant with me, she'd for some reason want to go down and eat that stuff frozen on the inside." And I go, "Oh, that's pica." Modern doctors see pregnant women eating things like paint chips, ice cubes, and they think it's this weird sort of aberration, but a lot of people trace that back to geophagy, this idea that human beings have eaten and detoxified their diets with eating earth, and that in particular it was pregnant women who would do that. And now that tradition's been lost, and so you'll see women having these strange cravings during their pregnancies. Anyway, I'm curious as an introduction to what we're talking about. Do you agree or disagree? And
That was a
t-
great introduction.
talk to us about why people eat mud pies.
So there's two, and this is first of all, not eating earth is something that's unique and new in our species. This is something that many people around the world still do, and I'm convinced we've literally always been doing. And a great example, if you look at most animals, will intentionally consume earth. For a variety of different reasons. The two main reasons that it's done, both in human and other animal populations, is one for increase minerals. And we typically see that certainly if somebody's starving. Well, there's three main reasons: increase minerals. If somebody's in nutritional need, they'll do it. But also, pregnant and lactating women will often do it because that's their highest nutritional need in their entire lives, especially the lactating time. And the third reason is for detoxifying their food. And usually that comes in the form of eating certain kinds of clays. Clays like kaolinite is a great example. Montmorillite is another example, where these clays will bind with certain toxins. And when they come together and combine, our body won't recognize them, and it'll pass through our bodies. Meanwhile, we have the opportunity to not only enjoy the flavor of that food, but also extract the nutrition from that food when we're consuming it. So there's numerous, and the third reason is to fill our bellies. There's examples all over the world, and I remember, and I forget where this was, but there's a picture from National Geographic about 10 or 15 years ago. It was a gorgeous picture, and this guy was making these mud pies. They look like little mud plates and drying them in the sun. And this was in an area that was experiencing a famine, and people just wanted to eat something because it filled their
Yeah,
bellies and
yeah.
made them feel better. But it's the fact that we don't do it now is really strange. And I went. I've known about it for some time through anthropological work, and I wanted to know more. So I went down. There's a group in Bolivia. There's two communities that are still consuming earth while they eat really toxic form of potatoes, and again the toxin will bind. I'm sorry, the toxin in the potatoes will bind with these particular clays that they harvest just for this purpose and
Are
pass
these
through their
actual
bodies.
potatoes? Are they nightshade solanaceous plants?
No, they are actual potatoes, but they are
Yeah.
really early
Scopolamine and
landrace
stuff like that
versions.
that's in
Yeah,
there. Yeah. Okay.
and what I found really interesting about the entire experience. So I was down for a while with some Aymara Indians in Bolivia, and then some Quechua Indians in Peru. In Peru, the group I was with ferments their potatoes to do the same thing, but this group, no matter where I was, and I was down there for quite some time, I couldn't imagine anybody could eat as many potatoes as the people I was with would eat. And I lived in Ireland for a year, and it was nothing like the amount of potatoes these people would eat. And no matter how, and hundreds and hundreds of varieties of
I was gonna
potatoes,
say they got a lot of varieties, not
a
just
lot of them.
russets kicking around.
And sometimes they roasted them, sometimes they boiled them, sometimes they fried them, and sometimes they fermented them, and sometimes they ate them with clay, and all the ways that they ate them. Some of them were highly toxic. Some of them had the same toxic load as modern potatoes, which is still high enough. But what was fascinating, which speaks to two things, is that in almost every case, and I'm talking about witnessing the cooking of thousands of potatoes, they always peeled them. They
Hmm.
always peeled them, except for one instance. And when I asked them why, they said that's where most of the toxins are. And it makes sense. And it ends up being true. Most of the toxins in a potato are in the skin. And the reason is because that's the protective barrier. If the toxins are there to protect, and in this case, an important, the storehouse, the energy storehouse of the plant, they should be in that interface between that plant and the things that could be attacking it. So that's number one. And what's really cool about it is that it's not like peeling. If I said to you, here, peel a russet potato, and here's a potato peeler, you get it done in about 15 seconds. First of all, I didn't meet anybody with a potato peeler. They did it all with a knife. And more importantly, all these heirloom varieties of potatoes, none of them look like a football. None of them look like a russet potato. They look
Yeah,
like
yeah,
a troop of grapes. They were
yeah.
incredibly difficult to peel. And the fact that they spent so much time doing it really speaks to that it was important to them. And number two, the only time out of all of the times that I ate potatoes and cooked them that we didn't peel it was during when we ate them with clay. And it just so happens that the most toxic varieties of potatoes I ate the entire time down there were when we were eating them with the clay. And that really to me speaks to the power of the clay to detoxify those
When I
potatoes.
being dipping down. Well, first of all, being up in Cusco, I'm eating a lot of ash and lime because I'm a coca fiend. And if you put me in any kind of marketplace where I can get coca leaves, I'm going to get a lot of ash in my diet too. But dipping down into the jungle from there, I remember one morning watching the parrots come in
Hmm.
to feed on a big clay cliff. And as I understand it, those parrots are coming in, filling their bellies with clay in the morning, and then they're going out and feeding on seeds all day that have a really high toxic
Yep.
burden. And that's how they're detoxifying. And I'm always fascinated by how clay works, electrically, because it's this adsorption effect, right? Where it's actually binding. Most of your toxins are going to be positively charged. You have this high negatively charged surface area of the clay particles. And then you've got this cool, almost like magnetic type electrical phenomenon that yanks this stuff, onto itself so that you don't end up absorbing it. It's just a really cool process. And then with charcoal, we see it today. I mean, if you work in ambulance, it's like if somebody's got a poisoning, the first thing that comes out is activated charcoal. Or if
Yep.
you buy a Brita filter and you crack that thing open, it's like, oh, they're using charcoal to detoxify the water. So this phenomenon is known today. It's still utilized today. It just doesn't make it into our diet really anymore.
No, and the reason I bring it up, and there's so many other things that could have been brought up, things like pre-mastication, or adults chewing their food and
Right.
parents chewing their food. There's a lot of, and which imparts incredible enzymes and creates a bonding. There's all sorts of reasons to do it. It's not part of our conscious now, but I did want to throw between the insects and this chapter, throw a few things into the conversation because I do not only I do feel they're important, but also if we're really at a point now where we've never been so sick as a species,
Yeah.
and we are killing ourselves and the planet with the way that we're eating. And if we're really after if we're truly after engaging in a conversation to solve this problem, then we need all the tools in our toolkit. And maybe clay doesn't make a difference or not, but I do want people to think in a much broader sense, and really have an understanding, like, listen, we've been doing this for millions of years and doing it really, really well. And this was certainly a part of that diet.
I keep charcoal in my dental kit, and I've kept bentonite clay. I think that's a montmorillonite. I keep that in my first aid kit in my backpack because, and this is just an anecdote, but it's something that really struck me. Years ago, I had a friend misidentify a mushroom and started having symptoms of poisoning. I started feeding him bentonite clay, and he recovered very quickly from that.
Fascinating, really. And
So
did you
just
know that
something.
that could have been a thing? I mean, did you know that
Well,
was
yeah, I knew it because I got a background in emergency medicine, and was aware of how bentonite worked, and it just seemed to me like, hey, let's try it, because I had it, and so since then, I always just keep some with me. It just seems like a smart thing to have on hand in case of poisonings. So, again, an anecdote, definitely not something I can say for sure was the cause of his recovery, but he sure thought so, and so did I. So To me, this is just something useful to keep in mind. And again, like, sometimes like if I'm wanting to get stains off my teeth, it's like I'll go to activated charcoal, brush my teeth with it, try to swallow a little of it because I know it's not, you look at the degree to which animals will go. I love the stories of, I don't know if you've ever seen Cindy Engel's book, Wild Health, where she talks about elephants excavating huge ancestral clay mines where they go to feed on clay. But yeah, this seems to me this thing that we've really left out of the equation. So I thought it was really astute of you to bring this in here, as far out as it might seem to some people. It's actually a really, pertinent part of the whole story. So I just think your book's got a real cool, complete thing going on here. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much. That means a whole lot.
Yeah, man. Well, tell people about where to get your book. One of the things I noticed kind of looking at your stuff is like, wow, this guy's got a lot going on. So to break it all down for people, how do they find you? Tell people about your different projects and all the things you got going.
Sure. Thanks. Thank you. So the book launches in the U.S. on November 6th, launched in the U.S. and several other countries on November 16th. And you can get it on all the major book selling outlets. It's certainly on pre-order now. We do have a lot of things going on, and I think that speaks to how important my wife and I, my entire family, take this mission that we've really taken on. Education is a huge piece of what we do. So we have a nonprofit called the Eastern Shore Food Lab, which is focused on research and education. And you can find information about that at eatlikeahuman.com, as well as some of our other ventures. And on top of that, we love engaging in these discussions like you and I just had. We love teaching. We love inspiring people. But we also realize that there's a real need, that some people just don't want to spend the time in the kitchen, or just don't have the time to, or maybe the skill set to, and really just want the food itself. So we started the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, which is where we're providing food based on solely on our message and mission to use ancestral and traditional approaches and techniques to food to create the most nourishing and safe, bioavailable, and nutrient-dense forms of that food for the human body. So we have a sourdough bakery. We're nixtamalizing maize. We're doing complete approaches, nose-to-tail approaches to animals. We're doing a lot of different fermentations. And we have a storefront here in Chestertown, Maryland. So you can find information about that at themodernstoneagekitchen.com. You can find me on social media at Dr. Bill Schindler, Dr. Bill Schindler, and also follow the Modern Stone Age Kitchen at Modern Stone Age Kitchen.
Man, I am really looking forward to having another chat with you. So I hope you'd be willing to come back on sometime.
Absolutely.
And just kind of, I'd love to dig into just philosophically some of this anthropology ideas about origins. There's just so much there. I can tell you're pretty steeped in all this stuff as well. So it's rare and fun to find a like mind. Thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you for this book, which is, but I just want to tell people too, there's a lot of recipes in here. The book is punctuated by recipes. So if you're hearing this stuff and you're like wondering, like, how do you put it all together? The book is quite a simple, layout, and the recipes are in there, so you can really follow along and actually do this stuff. But yeah, thank you for putting all of this together in such a simple way, because this stuff should be obvious, but we've really lost touch, and I appreciate what you've kind of resurrected for us. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be on here. I love your work, and thank you for helping me share my message.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.